When we look at a map of the world, it seems complete. Every coastline is carefully traced, every island named, and every ocean shaded in endless blue. To the eye, it looks finished, as if nothing could be missing. And yet, beneath the surface of the sea lies another world, one far older than our maps. There are mountains higher than the Alps, valleys deeper than the Grand Canyon, and wide plateaus that stretch silently across the ocean floor. For as long as people have looked across the water, they have wondered what secrets it hides, and what might have been lost forever. Among those whispers of vanished lands, one name has survived the passage of time: Lemuria. Could this missing continent have been real? And if it did exist, what if Lemuria was deliberately erased from the map? The story of Lemuria begins not in ancient legend, but in the 19th century, when science was still charting the boundaries of the natural world. A British zoologist, studying the spread of animals, noticed a strange puzzle. Lemurs could be found in Madagascar and in India, yet not in Africa or the Middle East. To him, the pattern suggested that something was missing. He imagined a landmass, once stretching across the Indian Ocean, connecting distant shores. From the lemurs he studied, he gave this imagined land its name, Lemuria. What began as a hypothesis soon escaped the confines of science. Writers began to describe Lemuria as more than a land bridge for animals. They imagined a continent alive with rivers and valleys, with people and cities now long forgotten. Mystics spoke of it as a cradle of wisdom, a homeland destroyed by the sea. And across the coasts of the Indian Ocean, older stories seem to echo the same idea, of kingdoms drowned, of lands that vanished, of ancestors who came from places no longer found on any map. None of these tales proved Lemuria, yet together they gave the name a strange power. It lingered in memory, refusing to fade. To this day, Lemuria sits in that space between fact and myth, between science and story. It reminds us that the sea is not only a path of travel, but also a keeper of silence. It carries ships across its surface, but it also hides ruins, swallows villages, and buries entire coastlines. What the water takes, it keeps. And so, the idea of a lost continent has never fully disappeared. Tonight, our journey begins with the origins of Lemuria, when a simple idea first gave shape to its name. From there, we will explore the visions and mysteries imagined for this lost land, consider the many theories of how it may have disappeared, and reflect on the legacy its memory still carries today. If you would like to hear more of these forgotten chapters of history, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more journeys into the past. The story of Lemuria begins not with myth or speculation, but with science. In 1864, the British zoologist Philip Lutley Sclater published a paper on the distribution of animals. His attention had been drawn to lemurs, the small primates that live mostly in Madagascar. Curiously, they were also found in India, but not in the lands between. Africa, Arabia, and the surrounding regions were entirely absent of them. This irregular pattern puzzled him. To Sclater, it was not enough to accept coincidence. He suggested that long ago, Madagascar and India had been joined by a stretch of land now gone. The lemurs had once crossed this land freely, and when the sea rose to claim it, they remained separated on the distant shores we see today. From the creatures that inspired his thought, he gave the vanished land a name, Lemuria. Sclater's proposal was simple but bold. It was not meant as a story or a myth, but as an explanation in zoology. Yet the idea quickly took root beyond his original work. In the following years, it was expanded by Ernst Haeckel, a German naturalist and philosopher. Haeckel was searching for the origins of humankind. He saw in Lemuria not just a bridge for animals, but the birthplace of humanity itself. According to his theory, the earliest humans had arisen on this lost continent before migrating outward. Though later research in anthropology and genetics placed human origins in Africa, Haeckel's interpretation left a lasting impression. Lemuria was no longer only a solution to the lemur problem. It had become a proposed cradle of civilization. This early history is important. It shows that Lemuria did not begin as a tale of mystery or conspiracy. It began in mainstream science, with scholars who tried to understand the natural world. Their ideas were shaped by the evidence available at the time, and even as later discoveries proved them wrong, the name and the possibility remained. Beyond ideas, the Indian Ocean itself preserves landscapes that seem to echo what Sclater and Haeckel imagined. To the east of Madagascar stretches the Mascarene Plateau, a vast submerged formation covering more than 115,000 square kilometers. Today, only a few islands stand above the surface: Mauritius, Réunion, and Rodrigues. The rest lies underwater, covered in reefs and sand. To geologists, the plateau looks like the remains of a much larger structure, an ancient highland mostly lost to the sea. To stand on Mauritius is to stand on one of its last surviving peaks. Further north lies the Saya de Malha Bank, one of the largest shallow banks in the world. In some places, the water above it is no deeper than 7 to 10 meters. During the last ice age, when global sea levels were more than 100 meters lower, much of this region would have been dry land. What is now open sea would have been a plain, perhaps grassland, exposed to wind and Sunday. When the glaciers melted and sea levels rose by 120 to 130 meters, those plains were drowned, leaving only shallow seas behind. Another discovery gave further weight to the idea that fragments of vanished continents lie beneath the Indian Ocean. In 2013, researchers studying volcanic rocks on Mauritius found microscopic zircon crystals trapped within. These tiny minerals, examined under a microscope, revealed their extraordinary age, more than 3 billion years. Such crystals cannot form on young volcanic islands, which are only a few million years old. They had to come from ancient continental crust, pieces of land broken off from a much older continent. This fragment was given a name, Mauritia, a microcontinent hidden beneath lava and sea, a real example of land once above water, later submerged. Together, these geological records remind us that the Earth itself is restless. Continents move, seas rise and fall, and the line between land and ocean shifts with time. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically, drowning coastlines across the world. In that time, whole landscapes disappeared, and with them, the homes of countless people and animals. Such changes are recorded not only in rocks and sediment, but perhaps also in memory. For across the Indian Ocean, stories of drowned lands have been carried for centuries. In the Tamil tradition of southern India, ancient texts such as the Silapatikaram and the Kalitokai speak of Kumari Kandam, a land that once stretched far to the south. It was described as a place of rulers, poets, and knowledge, a cradle of Tamil culture. In the stories, this land was eventually swallowed by the sea, leaving behind only fragments of its memory in literature and legend. On the island of Madagascar, oral traditions preserve a similar theme. Among the Malagasy people, elders speak of ancestors who came from lands that no longer exist. These tales are not maps or measurements, but they are echoes. They describe origins in a place lost to the ocean, remembered only in story. When science and tradition are placed side by side, they seem to strengthen one another. On one hand, zoologists and geologists point to missing animals, drowned plateaus, shallow banks, and ancient crystals as evidence that lost lands may have existed in the Indian Ocean. On the other, poems and oral histories speak of territories taken by the sea, remembered by those whose ancestors once lived there. Each strand alone might be doubted, but together they weave a picture that is difficult to ignore. Thus, the background of Lemuria rests upon three foundations. First, the scientific proposals of Sclater and Haeckel, who began the story not in legend but in the effort to explain the world. Second, the geological record, which reveals that real fragments of ancient continents lie beneath the Indian Ocean. And third, the traditions of Tamil literature and Malagasy memory, which recall lands taken by water. Each adds weight to the other. Lemuria began as science, but it has endured as story. It reminds us that the sea does not only connect, it also erases. And what it erases, it sometimes leaves behind in fragments of land and fragments of memory. If you are still with us on this journey, take a moment to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. In the next part, we will step into legend itself, exploring the achievements and mysteries that later writers imagined for this lost continent. When Lemuria passed from science into memory, it was no longer imagined as a strip of rock beneath the sea. It became a civilization, alive with culture, power, and knowledge. In southern India, this vision took its strongest form. Tamil tradition remembered Lemuria as Kumari Kandam, a vast land stretching far beyond the present coast, later swallowed by the ocean. Ancient Tamil texts such as the Silapatikaram and the Kalitakai, composed more than 1,000 years ago, spoke of kingdoms and rulers whose lands vanished beneath rising waters. Kumari Kandam was described not as wilderness, but as a radiant homeland, a cradle of culture where cities prospered and learning was honoured. At the heart of this memory were the Sangam assemblies. Tradition held that 3 great Sangams took place over thousands of years. The first was said to have lasted millennia, in a city now beneath the sea. These gatherings were remembered as academies where poets, philosophers and scholars came together, supported by dynasties who placed knowledge above conquest. The image is vivid, halls filled with verses, debates on ethics and science, kings listening as wisdom was recited. Kumari Kandam was not only land, but a stage for thought and art, as enduring in memory as Athens or Alexandria. The Sangam poems that survive today speak of landscapes now gone. They describe rivers crossing fertile plains, kings whose realms thrived along coasts, and the slow advance of the sea. These verses, preserved through centuries, carry echoes of Lemuria. They remind us that the idea of a drowned homeland was not invention, but part of living tradition, passed down in words as carefully as history itself. Beyond literature, the coastline offers its own testimony. On the shore of Tamil Nadu stands Mahabalipuram, long famed for its rock-cut shrines. For centuries, legend told of 7 temples built by ancient kings. Only one remained visible, while the others were said to lie beneath the waves. This story was repeated for generations. In December 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami struck. Before the wave reached land, the sea withdrew for a brief moment. Witnesses saw stone walls and carved foundations exposed on the seabed. When the waters surged back, the vision disappeared. But divers and archaeologists from the Geological Survey of India later confirmed that ruins do lie offshore. The 7 pagodas, once dismissed as myth, had revealed themselves. Mahabalipuram became proof that legends of drowned temples were rooted in reality. The mystery did not end there. Marine surveys conducted by India's National Institute of Oceanography revealed patterns beneath the waves off Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka. Sonar images recorded long lines resembling walls, rectangles like courtyards, and circles suggesting ancient foundations. Some say these shapes are natural, others see them as remnants of cities. Whatever the conclusion, the images echo the stories of drowned settlements. They suggest that beneath the Indian Ocean, the outlines of Lemuria still rest, hidden in the dark. Together, the Sangam poems, the memory of Kumari Kandam, and the ruins offshore form a picture that is hard to ignore. Lemuria emerges not as empty land, but as a civilization. It is remembered in literature, glimpsed in archaeology, and traced by instruments that search the seafloor. Symbols in culture add another layer. In Tamil art, the serpent appears as guardian of wisdom, the sun as witness of time, and the sea as both giver and destroyer. These are not abstract images. They live in festivals still celebrated, where offerings are carried to the waves and prayers for protection are sung. In these rituals, the ocean is honoured as both cradle and grave. They preserve a memory older than the temples themselves, that the sea once gave life, and later took it away. The memory of Lemuria also travelled across oceans. In Madagascar, oral traditions preserved by French chroniclers in the 17th century tell of ancestors who came from a drowned land to the east. In Sri Lanka, stories survive of kingdoms taken by the sea, leaving fragments of ruins behind. Though far apart, these echoes strengthen the memory. They suggest that across the Indian Ocean, people carried the same awareness, that land was lost to water, and with it a part of their origin. To imagine Lemuria is to picture a homeland where cities stood, temples shone, and scholars debated the meaning of life. It is to see fertile plains, flowing rivers, and coastlines busy with trade and ceremony. It is to recall a civilization that valued knowledge as much as power, and poetry as much as stone. These are not inventions without root, They are supported by texts, by ruins glimpsed beneath the waves, by sonar that records what eyes cannot see, and by traditions that continue to honour the sea. Lemuria's achievements live in memory not because of what was written in science, but because of what endured in culture. The Sangams remain in Tamil identity. The 7 pagodas have been confirmed in stone. The sonar charts record patterns beneath the sea, and the rituals still speak to an ocean that both protects and destroys. Each piece strengthens the others, creating a layered vision of a land that once was. And yet the mystery endures. If Lemuria was only a story, why did poets describe its kings and rivers? Why did the sea in 2004 reveal the ruins of temples long dismissed as myth? Why do sonar images show what looks like streets beneath the waves? The ocean conceals, but it also remembers. In those rare moments when it reveals its secrets, Lemuria feels alive again, not as theory but as a civilization glimpsed through time. Stay with us. In the next part, we will trace the clues and uncover why Lemuria was finally lost to the sea. Every story of a lost land must arrive at the same question: how could it have vanished? In the case of Lemuria, answers have been sought in the movements of the sea, the shifting of the earth, the sudden strike of the heavens, and the choices of history itself. To follow these paths is to watch Lemuria disappear, not once, but twice. It sank first into the Indian Ocean, and later it was erased from the record of human thought. The first and most visible power was the sea. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, the glaciers that had locked vast regions of the world began to break. Their melting waters poured into rivers, and the rivers poured into the oceans. Scientists studying ancient coral terraces in the Seychelles and submerged valleys in the Maldives have shown that over the course of several millennia, the oceans rose by more than 100 meters. The change redrew every coastline on Earth. Valleys that had carried rivers and villages filled with salt water. Broad plains, once green with forests and fields, slipped beneath shallow seas and became continental shelves. In the Indian Ocean, this transformation was immense. The Saya de Malha, a plateau the size of a small country, lies only a few dozen meters below the waves. The Mascarene Plateau, more than 100,000 square kilometers wide, is just as shallow. In an age when the sea was lower, these plateaus would have stood as broad tracts of land, perhaps supporting rivers, grasslands, and human settlements. As the waters advanced, generation by generation, the land would have been surrendered. If Lemuria was real, it may have been here, lost slowly to the ocean until only distant islands like Mauritius, Réunion, and the Seychelles remained as fragments of a greater whole. The sea was not the only force. Beneath the waters, the earth itself was shifting. The Indo-Australian plate, which lies under much of the Indian Ocean, is among the most active of the planet's foundations. Over millions of years it pressed northward, colliding with Asia and lifting the Himalayas to their present heights. Modern seismic records show that this plate continues to fracture, breaking into smaller sections, some of which are sinking into the deep. A continent caught in such slow upheaval could never remain intact. It would crack, tilt, and subside until its highest summits survived only as scattered ridges and islands. The presence of submerged features such as the Seychelles Plateau and the Laccadive Chagos Ridge shows that this process has been at work for ages. If Lemuria once lay here, the relentless shifting of the earth could have carried it downward, stone by stone, until it was gone. Not all destruction, however, is slow. Around 12,800 years ago, the planet endured an abrupt cooling known as the Younger Dryas. One line of evidence suggests that the cause was a cosmic strike, perhaps a comet or meteor that shattered in the atmosphere. In sites across North America, Greenland, and even as far away as Syria, layers of Earth have been found that contain platinum, nanodiamonds, and tiny glass-like spherules, all signs of an impact. According to this view, the disaster set off massive wildfires, fractured ice sheets, and triggered floods on a scale scarcely imaginable. If such an event touched the Indian Ocean, low-lying lands could have been overwhelmed almost instantly. For the people of that age, the sudden loss of their homes to the sea would not have been a theory, but a memory, passed on in story until it grew into the legend of a drowned continent. Taken together, these possibilities, the rise of the sea, the shifting of the crust, the strike of the heavens, remind us of how fragile every land has always been. Continents are not eternal. They rise, they fall, and the shorelines that seem so fixed today may not endure tomorrow. A place that flourishes in one age may be gone in the next. Yet Lemuria's disappearance was not only physical, it was also an erasure of the mind. In 1864, the British zoologist Philip Sclater proposed the name in his study of the mammals of Madagascar, suggesting that a land once joined Madagascar to India. A few decades later, the German naturalist Ernst Haeckel gave the idea greater scope, imagining Lemuria as the cradle of early humanity in his History of Creation. For a time, the idea of Lemuria was part of scientific debate. It was printed in books, spoken of in lecture halls, and considered by serious men of learning. But in the early 20th century, science turned elsewhere. Alfred Wegener's theory of continental drift, published in 1912, and the later acceptance of plate tectonics in the 1,960 seconds, offered new answers to the puzzles of species distribution. The concept of a drowned land bridge was no longer needed. By the middle of the century, Lemuria had been set aside as a relic of the 19th century, erased from the official record even as it lived on in imagination. This erasure created a paradox. In 2013, a team of geologists working on the island of Mauritius broke open volcanic rock and discovered tiny crystals of zircon inside. These crystals were more than 3 billion years old, far older than the island itself, which had formed only a few million years ago. Such ancient minerals could only have come from continental crust, not oceanic stone. The finding, published in Nature Geoscience, proved that fragments of a drowned continent do indeed lie beneath the Indian Ocean. The scientists named it Mauritia, a microcontinent hidden under the waves. The discovery confirmed that land had once existed in precisely the region where Sclater had placed it. Yet by that time the name Lemuria had already been removed from science. The truth had returned, but the word remained in legend. There are some who wonder if this silence is more than coincidence. In the 1,990 seconds and 2000s, surveys of the Indian Ocean floor were conducted by the National Institute of Oceanography in Goa. Sonar revealed shapes that looked unexpectedly regular, terraces, ridges, and formations that suggested walls or courtyards. Reports noted them, but follow-up work was scarce, and the details remained in specialist circles. To those who speak of forbidden history, this quiet is telling. They ask whether the sea hides not only ridges of stone, but also the ruins of cities, blurred by time, unacknowledged in archives, waiting to be seen again. Whether one accepts these suspicions or not, the result is the same. Lemuria has been lost twice. Nature may have drowned the land. Human science has erased the name. What remains is a paradox. We know that fragments of continents like Mauritia exist beneath the sea. We know that sea levels once rose by more than 100 meters and drowned coasts around the world. We know that cultures from India to Madagascar still preserve tales of homelands swallowed by water. Yet the name Lemuria is absent, left to live only in story. Do you believe Lemuria once stood as a real land, only to be erased from history itself? Tell us what you think in the comments. Lemuria may have vanished from the maps of science, but it never truly disappeared from human thought. Its memory still rises in the findings of science and in the visions of mystics, a legacy that refuses to fade. The first echo came from science itself. For decades, geologists regarded Lemuria as a discarded idea, a relic from before the theory of plate tectonics. Yet in 2017, a group of researchers announced something remarkable. Zealandia, a continent almost entirely submerged beneath the Pacific Ocean, deserved recognition as Earth's eighth continent. Covering nearly 2 million square miles, with only its highest peaks forming the islands of New Zealand, Zealandia had been hidden in plain sight. When the news broke, many outside the scientific community reached for a familiar comparison. Headlines called Zealandia a real-life Atlantis, while others spoke of it as a scientific Lemuria. The name rose unbidden, showing that even after more than a century, Lemuria remained the symbol people used to imagine a drowned continent. At the same time, the study of microcontinents, smaller fragments of ancient crust scattered beneath the seas, reminded the world that Earth's surface is still shifting, and that vast portions of land can sink, fragment, and vanish from view. Scientists may not speak of Lemuria, but their discoveries continually echo its possibility. While science moved on, mysticism gave Lemuria a second life. In 1888, the Russian philosopher and occultist Helena Blavatsky published The Secret Doctrine, a sprawling work of esoteric history. There, she described Lemuria as the cradle of the third root race, an early stage of humanity that lived before Atlantis. According to her vision, Lemurians were the ancestors of humankind, a people whose continent was destroyed but whose memory survived in myth. Though scholars rejected her claims, Blavatsky's influence was wide. Through theosophy, Lemuria became more than a lost land. It became a sacred origin, a stage in the hidden story of human development. In her telling, the ocean had taken not just soil and stone, but an entire chapter of humanity's spiritual past. The theosophical vision did not fade with the 19th century. In the 20th, New Age writers reshaped Lemuria again. They described it as a land of harmony and peace, a civilization guided by intuition rather than technology. Where Atlantis came to symbolize pride and downfall, Lemuria represented balance and wisdom. In these accounts, Lemuria's destruction was not a punishment for arrogance, but a tragedy, a reminder of knowledge lost too soon. The image endured because it offered something Atlantis did not, the dream of a gentle world free from conflict, swallowed by the sea but preserved in memory. For some, this memory became more than a symbol. In California, Mount Shasta rose as a sacred landscape. By the early 20th century, stories spread that survivors of Lemuria had retreated into hidden chambers within the mountain. They were said to live in silence, luminous and wise, guarding truths that the modern world had forgotten. Visitors spoke of encounters, visions, and a sense of presence that lingered among its slopes. To these communities, Lemuria was not a legend of the past, but a reality of the present. The mountain became a place of pilgrimage, a reminder that belief can restore what maps erase. And so, the legacy of Lemuria does not end here. As this story drifts from memory into mystery, we turn now to reflect on what it leaves us, and what secrets may still lie waiting in the dark beyond. Lemuria is only one name among many that have drifted through time. The ocean holds more than water. It holds silence, depth, and a memory far older than ours. Tonight we have followed one of those memories, a continent erased from maps but still alive in story. Yet the mystery of Lemuria is not unique. All around the world there are other lands whispered about, other traces of worlds that slipped away. Sailors once spoke of Atlantis in the Western Sea, a city of light lost beneath the waves. In the waters of Japan, the terraces of Yonaguni rise like steps into a forgotten temple. In the North Sea, fishermen still bring up wood, tools, and bones from Doggerland, a plain that once stretched between Britain and Europe before the tide returned to claim it. Each of these places shows us that shorelines are fragile, and that what seems permanent may vanish in a single age. Lemuria stands among them not as proof or as myth alone, but as a reminder. It reminds us that human memory stretches beyond science and into legend, and that what we call history may only be a fragment of the greater past. A lost continent becomes more than geography. It becomes a symbol of absence, of how much has slipped beneath the waves unseen. The sea rarely gives back what it has taken. Yet sometimes it reveals fragments, a shard of pottery dredged from the deep, a ruin glimpsed when the tide retreats, or a story carried across generations until it finds us again. Each fragment is like a lantern on a dark shore, showing us that the past is not closed, only hidden. So Lemuria endures, not as a line on a chart, but as an invitation. The ocean becomes more than water, a vast library of forgotten worlds. Myths become more than stories, echoes from what has been erased. And within that silence we are left to wonder what else may lie hidden, waiting beneath the waves. If Lemuria was once erased by water, by time, and by history itself, how many other chapters of our past remain unseen? If this journey felt meaningful to you, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more forgotten histories. Until next time, sleep well. Good night.